there are other ways that we can assess over time and then make more interpretations. But in the HRV space, context is king. Like without context, HRV as a number doesn't provide us with a ton of valuable information. Actually, heart rate over time, or maybe even as a snapshot, provides us with a little bit more fidelity information. HRV is all about context and it's all about trends. That's what I tell people.
Welcome to the Optimized Woman, the podcast for high-performing women ready to take back their health. I'm Orshi McNaughton, a board-certified holistic health practitioner and functional nutritionist. If you're tired of feeling stuck, you can't lose the weight no matter what you do, your energy is in the toilet, your metabolism feels like it's at a standstill, and you lost the spark you once had, then you're in the right place. We are here to unleash the unstoppable force you're meant to be and give you the tools to fix what's holding you back. So if you're ready to own it, start thriving again and live the life you deserve, and let's get to it. Today, we are joined by Dr. Jay Wiles, a clinical health psychologist and recognized authority in heart rate variability, also known as HRV. This episode, originally recorded for the Women's Biohacking Conference by my co-host Katie Moore, takes a deep dive into how HRV can serve as a powerful tool for understanding and managing stress. In this conversation, Dr. Wiles breaks down the science behind HRV, explaining its connection to your nervous system, stress response, and overall health. He also debunks common myths about HRV metrics, shed lights on why context is the key when interpreting your HRV data, and explores how genetics, lifestyle, and even gender can impact this critical metric. We also discuss the transformative potential of biofeedback, how to train your nervous system for resilience, and why stress isn't inherently bad when you learn to embrace it and adopt. So if you're looking to build stress resilience and feel stronger and more balanced, this episode is for you. So let's dive in.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Katie Moore, the co-host of the Women's Biohacking Conference. And today I'm excited because I'm joined by my good friend, Dr. Jay Wiles. And we're here to talk all about HRV and what we can learn about our stress by using this very important metric. So a little bit of background about my guest today. Dr. Jay Wiles is an international speaker, a scientist, clinician, influencer, and subject matter expert and authority on the interconnection between the human stress response and health performance/optimization. As a certified clinical health and performance psychologist, he specializes in heart rate variability, or HRV biofeedback, and he is the co-founder of Hanu Health, which has advanced the use of HRV and respiratory training for peak performance diagnostics and therapeutics. He's collaborated with top athletes across multiple sports and manages Thrive Wellness and Performance, which partners with biotech firms on R&D and behavioral programs. And since 2019, Jay has also co-hosted the Ben Greenfield podcast and hosts the Hanu Health podcast. My gosh, that's a lot. Welcome to the
I know.
show,
I should have just sent
Dr.
over a less
Jay.
egotistical bio.
No, it's great. It's so many accomplishments and it makes me feel like such an underachiever. So now I'm stressed. No, I'm just kidding.
There you go. Your HRV has plummeted and you're like, okay, I'm done with this. Look what this guy's already done to me.
Well, we've obviously talked, for several months. I love and continue to use the Hanu, health device. And I found it is, it's always evolving. And I think just like the HRV space has kind of been evolving. I think about when I first even learned what HRV was, it was, using like an Oura ring, and I didn't really have an understanding of what it really meant. And so I would love, as a, world-renowned expert on HRV, for you to kind of maybe like break down what this metric really is telling us and sort of demystify all the claims in the space, because there's a lot.
Oh my goodness, boy, is there. I mean, it's gotten so crazy just how how just mythical this is of terms of like where HRV should be and or shouldn't be. It's just, I hear all of these claims. And so I love to kind of come in and just break those up a lot. It's funny because you were mentioning about how your first like exposure to heart rate variability was with Oura Ring. And I think for a lot of people, that was it. The advent of wearables has made this data that used to be not accessible whatsoever to now very accessible, because my first exposure to it was when I was working in clinic, both research and then also as like a clinician, where we were using, $25, $30, $100,000 EKGs with patients and using that in the biofeedback setting. And now we've got it to where the technology we have now is more accurate than what we were using, 15, 20 years ago, which is just like bonkers to me, but like so exciting, because I think about how in the next 15, 20 years, what are we going to do? It's going to be nuts. So I'm glad to be along for the ride there. So let's talk about heart rate variability just at its most basic foundation. I think a lot of people, when they think heart rate variability, they think heart rate, and they think that it must be interrelated. And it is interrelated with one another, but it's not the same thing. I always explain heart rate variability by explaining heart rate, because sometimes people don't intuitively understand heart rate, but then when I share about it, they're like, oh, that makes sense. So let's say you look on your Apple Watch right now, or your Whoop, or your Oura, or whatever's tracking heart rate. Maybe it's your Hanu, and you see that your heart rate right now is 60 BPM, or 60 beats per minute. What that means is that on average, within a 60-second window, your heart is beating once per second. 60 seconds, 60 beats per minute. That means a cadence of 1 every second. Now, is that really how this is working? And the answer to that unequivocally is no, that is not how that is working. If that were the case and your heart was beating once every single second and was paced that way, well, then we think about heart rate variability, or how much it varies from one another, would be zero. Not a good thing. We don't want to see a 0 milliseconds heart rate variability. When in fact, what's happening with heart rate is your heart is speeding up and it's slowing down, and it's speeding up and it's slowing down. And the main predominant variable that's occurring there is your breathing. Breathing is the major influence as to why your heart rate's going up and down and up and down. So instead of 60 beats per minute, it's more like it's like 50 and then going up to 70 and then going back down to 50 and then back up to 70. And the average of that is 60 beats per minute. So that's heart rate. So now let me explain heart rate variability. So if your heart rate is speeding up and slowing down and speeding up and slowing down, the time between heartbeats is changing significantly. As your heart rate goes up on inhalation, what happens to the variance, or the change in time between your heartbeats? It's going down and down and down. And as you exhale, what's happening? The amount of time between your heartbeats is going up and up and up. So across that breath cycle, your heart is varying significantly in terms of the beats intervals. They're varying differently from one another. That is a good sign. It's a normal sign. That's what we really want to see. But what is it a sign of? It's a sign that your nervous system is adjusting based on, and what I say is adjusting accordingly to kind of the environment. So heart rate variability at its most simplest form is your body's dynamic ability, your nervous system's dynamic ability to adjust to its external or internal environment. Another even more simple way to put it is that it is a direct measurement of how well your stress response is either being activated or deactivated. In an effort to not open up too much gory detail about it, I think a lot of people have come across the idea of the fight or flight response, or the relaxation response. We would call that in scientific terms the sympathetic response, fight or flight, and then the relaxation response, or the more kind of like the rest and digest response, being called the sympathetic. As someone has an increase in heart rate variability, again, more adaptability to its internal or external environment, we see more activation of the parasympathetic response. We might call that the vagal brake, which refers to the vagus nerve. When we see heart rate variability going down, we may see a removal of that vagal brake. So someone's stress response is being activated. They could have a sympathetic response, but a lot of the times it's more just a lifting of the vagal brake. So HRV gives us really good insight into that. Whereas heart rate can actually tell us a lot about how well we're adapting to stress. It's not nearly as microscopic or high fidelity or as granular as HRV, which is why I typically turn to HRV as the predominant way for measuring adaptability of the stress response. So that's kind of it in its nutshell. And we can obviously unpack it as much as you want, Katie. Yeah. But I want to mention, and the kind of thing that you asked about was like demystifying kind of this number that is HRV. So many people now, I think, have a misunderstanding of how to interpret their number, because HRV operates as a metric very differently than how other metrics operate. We're so used to seeing like all of these normative numbers that we can compare to, whether it's, we look at a blood panel and we say, well, our cholesterol, or, our blood lipid panels, or, our BMI or blood pressure is a really good one. We have kind of like these, almost like these ranges that we want to be within, whereas HRV does not operate that way. Whereas like if you were to show, and what I mean by that is that if someone were to come in and they were a 34-year-old female, and then I have another 34-year-old female, and the first one walks in and they say, my HRV is 30 milliseconds. And then the other one walks in and they say, my HRV is 70 milliseconds. Could I make any interpretation based on that data? And the answer to that is not really. I have to have context. Yeah, I cannot make a lot of interpretation about that. And the reason being is because on paper, you may think, 70 milliseconds, like they are more than double that last person. And so therefore they must be more stress resilient, more fit, more fill in the blank. Well, the science doesn't necessarily agree with that, because what I might find, is that, it might depend on the time of day that I'm testing. Maybe that one person who just got done sprinting as fast as they can, and their HRV is normally 150 and now it's 30. Or even if I took it over time, I may find that individual who has a 30 millisecond HRV is someone that actually indicates I have no stress in my life, like things are kind of going well, health numbers are looking really well. Whereas the other person is like, oh man, this has been a really tough time in life. There are other ways that we can assess over time and then make more interpretations, but HRV, in the HRV space, context is king. Like without context, HRV as a number doesn't provide us with a ton of valuable information. Actually, heart rate over time, or maybe even as a snapshot, provides us with a little bit more fidelity information. HRV is all about context and it's all about trends. That's what I tell people. So my point here is never to compare yourself to anyone. HRV is a number that is only compared relative to your numbers and not to anyone else. Can you have a low HRV? The answer is yes. But what does that mean? Low in general or low relative to you? Yes, low relative to you. Low in general, it's a lot harder for us to establish. So sorry, I know that was really long-winded. I feel like I've been going forever, but there you have it.
That was amazing. And I just want to comment on a couple of things. Your description of HRV, I think that was one of the best, most comprehensive, but also easy to understand that I've heard from anyone. And I think, to clear up some of that confusion for people it's illuminating, because yes, I think it's so easy to just look at a number and say, oh my gosh, my HRV was 18 last night. Like I must be super stressed. And then to have it in the context and to have it in the 3-month span, the 6-month, and be like, oh, well, it's normally in the 50s and, maybe something happened, right? And that's where you can go and investigate. And that's what we do in this kind of health optimization space, is we then look for clues as to why something is off.
Yes.
Regarding the competition thing, I'm so glad you brought this up, because I know as like an alpha female type A, like I tend to ask some of my like male, counterparts, like, what's your HRV? And I have some friends in the space that just like their HRVs are in the hundreds, and mine is like in the teens to like low 20s, and it can be aggravating. And so I personally have stopped asking other people, but I know it's very tempting. And even, when you have friends that are measuring and you're like, why is that person's so much higher? That being said, let's talk about the relationship to just like your genetic profile, your like cortisol levels. Like sometimes it has nothing to do with like how stressed you are in life. It really is like HRV can have a lot to do with your, DNA and genetic breakdown. Right?
Yeah. 100%. I think it's the thing that goes overlooked so much because, again, it's really easy for us to see somebody's, aura post on Instagram and see that, oh goodness, like their, HRV is 125 and, mine's 20. Like, and I get emails and I've had this, for the past few years. It's like, am I going to die like of a cardiovascular event or something? Am I going to die of a stroke? And I'm like, all right, let's pump the brakes here. Like what's going to happen is you're going to worry about it so much that maybe you might lead yourself down that road. So let's just take a break, pull back a little bit, and really try to kind of like shine light on what it is exactly that we're looking for. And what are those contributors? What are those things that are the major variables that we have to consider within this framework? The biggest one is indeed that baseline heart rate variability has so many contributors. So there are a couple of things that I always like to list out that are not within your control. Now, are there things within our control that we can do to help regulate our nervous system, and then it is reflected in changes in heart rate variability? 100%. I mean, that's why I continue to have a job, is because I teach about that and can train people with that. However, what I will say is that there are some environmental and internal things that are occurring that can affect heart rate variability and nervous system functioning that are outside of our control. The number one thing that you've already mentioned is our genetic makeup. So we see this both in twin and familial studies. We've seen that people within the same genetic makeup hold together in terms of where their heart rate variability numbers are, aside from their overall health and well-being. I always like hesitate to share this, but I'm like, my dad's never going to see this, so I'll just go ahead and share it anyway.
Never say never. I'm sending him a link.
I know you're going to send him a link, and I'd be like, sorry, Dad, I wasn't bad mouthing you here, but I'm not saying anything he doesn't already know. Let's just say that, obviously my dad and I share a lot of the same genetic makeup. My dad is someone that he wears an Oura ring, and if you look at his overnight heart rate variability scores, not super dissimilar from me. If you look at the other aspects related to health behaviors compared to when I compare myself to my dad, again, we're kind of like night and day. I tend to be pretty dang health conscious, do a lot of things for overall health and wellness. Obviously, I train my nervous system like a nervous system ninja, and my dad does not do that. But our HRVs look pretty close to one another. And I would say also too that, compared to normative values, which there are normative values for HRV, we just don't use them for a lot of comparison. Most people would see my HRV baseline and say it's rather high. They would see his and see that it's rather high. So if we just looked at those numbers, we would say, oh man, yeah, both of those are probably doing the same things for their overall health and wellness. They're probably, really in shape. I would beg to differ on that. And that is because, again, the genetic makeup is a huge contributor. So we have to keep that in mind. So a lot of people may say, well, my goodness, I see, you are in the 100s, I'm in the 20s. And I would say, don't pat me on the back too much for this. I mean, yeah, I'm doing things for it, but my dad's not, and his is kind of close to mine. Now, here's one thing. You hook me up to a Hanu and you have me do a biofeedback practice, and I may take my HRV and increase it within the span of 5 minutes by 50 to 100%. You have someone with my same genetic makeup do it, and he may not be able to budge his heart rate variability. Well, what's that saying? It's saying that I have a lot more control over my nervous system because I've trained control over it, which is a huge advantage in our health, mental and physical health. So that's a big difference there. That means same baseline, but different control over in the nervous system. It's the control over the nervous system and how it's reflected in changes in HRV that is the most important thing. So genetics. Well, another thing is, and I kind of just got dealt the right card. I'm 6'5", and what the research has demonstrated is that height actually is associated with increased HRV. So shorter people tend to have lower HRV. Taller people tend to have higher. Out of our control, at least. I mean, I don't know. We could probably biohack height somehow, but I don't think a lot of people are too interested in doing that. I don't know. There's some crazy people out there. You never know. So my guess is that if you increase your height with some biohacks, it's probably not going to increase your HRV. And if it does, please report back to me because I want to publish a study on this. So that's one thing. Another thing is gender. So this is great for the Women's Biohacking Conference to remember. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that in terms of baseline HRV, males tend to have higher HRV. Women tend to have suppressed compared to men HRV. So again, this is why like for you, Katie, if you're asking your male friends, especially your tall male friends who happen to have pretty good genetics in the field of nervous system functioning, it's going to drive you bonkers. There's no reason to ask. It's just going to make you upset because you're like, well, damn, like, what do I do with this? And like, again, these are things that are outside of your control. I'm sure we're going to talk about the things that are within your control that you can work on, but those are things that are outside of your control. So yeah, I think that not making it a competition is the key component. And for us as like health optimizers, biohackers, peak performers, that's pretty dang tough to do. And I get it. I understand that. Be competitive with some other things, not HRV. It's just not worth your time.
That is just music to my ears. I appreciate you saying that so much. The tall thing, didn't know that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm like 5'6", so
Yeah.
I don't know how that works on the schedule, on the like scale, but
right.
So the gender thing, do we have like, is there any research or science as to why that is the case? I mean, I have my own theories, but do we have that?
A lot of the research right now is probably, I would consider it more theoretical than anything. And so what they've taken into consideration is indeed the physiological or biological differences between men and women. And how does that contribute to hormonal functioning? Obviously, you know, with menstruation, there's a huge difference there, and we can chat about that. And then also I think the biggest component here would just be, not necessarily genetic and DNA makeup, but kind of some of like those fixed characteristics that we know, and sometimes I wouldn't even say fixed characteristics, but some of those characteristics that tend to be stereotypical in terms of responses for males and females. So let's start off with kind of like the most basic one, which would be cortisol output. And a lot of this is actually going to be very dependent, especially, I would say only for women, during kind of their cycle. And so what we know is that when a woman is on their period, we know that there are significant enhancements in cortisol output, significant increases in heart rate and resting heart rate, and also a suppression of HRV. So we know this is happening every 28 days. And so therefore that is going to affect monthly the baseline for that individual. So there we go. We already see if we start on an even playing ground, the women just dropped a little bit in terms of HRV baseline. Let me make that clear from the men. The other thing that we know is that with that period of time, I mean, again, this is kind of the significance of this effect is different depending on the person and their genetic makeup and their hormonal makeup, is that stress load and emotional dysregulation that can occur during that time of the month also contributes to even more excess cortisol and can contribute to a flooding of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are neurotransmitters that are kind of very much associated with a sympathetic or fight or flight response. And therefore that can impact HRV as well. So those are the two like primary differences that we see with men and women that I would say has been theorized as the predominant reasons or maybe even mechanisms as to why women have a overall lower baseline HRV. And then, this is one, I think it's probably a little bit more controversial, but I'll say it anyway, is that when we look at, I would say it's from both a hormone perspective, but also emotional perspective, is that women tend to be more naturally anxious about things. And we have plenty of studies to validate and evidence for this. And this is, again, outside of, a woman's period, which is, again, it's very different. I would say it's very bio-individual. Some women it's not applicable to, but the studies have demonstrated that there's more of a generalization that we can make there. And because of that, the fluctuations of more heightened anxiety that a woman may have over kind of a male response to different internal, external circumstances can indeed suppress heart rate variability because it's more of an activation of the stress response throughout, any time of day, with sleep, kind of so on. So there are distinct differences. And I think that those are the big reasons. I would be very interested to hear though, Katie, if you have some other ideas as to why, and because I might be leaving some things out that I haven't mentioned yet, that I'm like, oh yeah, studies have kind of identified that.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, I think, women kind of play the role as caretakers, and can be a lot of, stress involved with trying to take care of the home and the family and, work. And there's just a lot of like a huge load. I mean, that would just be my kind of personal take. And, And then also like family dynamics, like seeing how your mother responded, right? And then because
Yes.
I think it's like nurture and nature. So my mother has always been, I hope she's not watching, has always been very high stress, high anxiety. And so therefore, as a kid, my sister and I sort of saw that dynamic happening. And I think I've absorbed some of that. My dad was chill AF.
Yes. Yes. I think you're totally right, though. I think you hit the nail on the head here. Is that a lot of times our response, our emotional and mental health response, our behavioral response, it comes from some of the formative years of where that behavior was modeled to us, and we cannot subtract from that. So again, that is something that is within your environment that I would throw into the category of you could not control that. You couldn't control the behavior that was modeled to you by your parents during your formative years. And so therefore your adaptation of that is really high, and it's going to affect nervous system functioning. I think in a way, ours might've been flip-flopped. Like mine was, my dad was the type A, like, could, throw down the iron fist. My mom was like the super, super chill. And like, I adopted like a little bit from both of them. And it's interesting to see, but we don't want to forget about that. That's a really good point.
Hey there, Orshi here with a quick message. This is a brand new podcast, and I would love your help with growing our community. If you're finding this discussion valuable, I would be honored if you take a moment to leave a review and share this episode with a girlfriend or any woman in your life who might benefit from this information. Your support truly makes a difference. So, thank you for helping me spread the word. And now, let's get back to our conversation.
I'd love to talk about pregnant women and what happens to the HRV when you go through that stage of life. And is that the right time to be measuring? And, I mean, I'm assuming all stages of life is great, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yes, this is a great question to ask. So when my wife was pregnant last with our youngest child, we did not have her on Hanu because Hanu was not such a thing. Like it wasn't even a thing. We started in 2021. My son was born in 2020, so she was pregnant mostly in 2019, 2020. Boy, would I have loved to have her on that. And she's going to listen to this and kill me for saying it, but I think that, she's gone through 2 pregnancies now. And so, we kind of understand kind of the fluctuations that can occur hormonally with, mood and stress and everything involved. It's a glorious time, and also it's a really stressful time, both just psychologically demanding, but also, hormonally very demanding. And so, to your point, is it an appropriate time to be measuring HRV? Because I just said I would, but that's because I love like just digging into the data. So for me, I'm like, oh, I kind of want to like experiment by testing here. Should the everyday individual do it? I would say yes, but I would say that there is a level of caution that we need to remember here. Let's say you're measuring with something like Hanu. So Hanu is different because we're looking at HRV and heart rate continuously throughout the day under all conditions. So we're really looking for trends throughout the day that's signifying when there's dynamic changes in the stress response, kind of more of the brake being put on, the brake being pulled off, the gas pedal being put on as well. So in that case, what we've actually seen is that when women are indeed pregnant, we see a lot more fluctuation. It's not as stable as when women are not pregnant. Now, why is that? A lot of different things, right? It could be the physiological, psychological experience of having, a lot more weight on you, the baby with you, hormones have changed. There's a lot of things that could be going on there. It's just generally, it can be a stressful time period for some people. And so we will see that happening. But what I say is most important for a woman who's pregnant is looking at the trends that they're having kind of on a day-by-day basis, not necessarily kind of a moment-by-moment basis, which might be more beneficial for people who aren't pregnant. But for women who are pregnant, I think that it's the overnight trends or the trends from day to day that can be incredibly valuable. Why is that? Well, the one thing that we don't want pregnant women doing is overdoing it and overtaxing their nervous system. Why? Because you overtax your nervous system. Guess what? You overtax the baby's nervous system. Pretty simple to understand here. So when we see a downward trend day in and day out of heart rate variability going in a downward direction, then that's indicative of stress on the body, psychological stress as well. Well, is that impacting the fetus? The baby? Yep, it is. So that is why I think it's almost imperative that women are indeed tracking it. I just might look at it a little bit differently. Whereas the more kind of crazy fluctuations that happen throughout the day with someone who is not pregnant, that might be some warning signs. For women who are pregnant, not as much of a warning sign, could be, but not as much. What I'm more considerate of is what is happening day over day, week over week.
Yes, yes. And again, it's like grain of salt, right? If you are somebody who is super dialed into your HRV before you get pregnant, you might have a little bit more understanding. But if you're just starting off and you're seeing these crazy ups and downs, I imagine it could be intimidating. But I want to harp on that one point you said of like understanding your stress load. And just speaking from experience, like I went through a very, very difficult time, almost a year ago, a breakup that was sudden and basically moved me across the country. I was trying to biohack my way out of the stress by doing cold plunges every day, hour-long saunas, fasting. Like I was throwing everything at my stress, thinking like, I can biohack it like a man, right?
Yeah.
And I got the Hanu. I started wearing it. My stress was my cortisol, I knew was high because I got blood work done. And then my HRV was continuing to drop. So I cut all of that stuff out. Literally, like it was an eye opening for me. And I then started to see some minor improvements. It wasn't drastic. It wasn't like, oh, you stopped cold plunging and now you're up here. Right. It was slow over time. But talk about how something like, tracking your HRV can actually influence your lifestyle, because I think this is really the bread and butter of where things come together for people, is understanding how it's affecting you.
Yeah, indeed. I think that I wouldn't blame you, right? Like if you go through a stressful situation, a period of life that's particularly challenging, it's kind of like, well, why not just throw everything at this? I think intuitively, like that's probably what I would say as well. I think though that, and I'm sure you would say this, is like looking back in retrospect, it's like, oh man, I had a taxed nervous system that was really stressed. And what I was actually doing was throwing a shit ton of stress on top of stress. And again, there are times where that can be really effective. But I think one thing and this is particular to women, is that a lot of times, a lot of women are taking some of the more male biohacking advice, which is just like, man, I cold plunge every single day. I sauna every single day. I, zone 2, 5 days a week. I zone 5, like 3 days a week. They do it. And the next thing they know, they go get tested. Their adrenals are like pooped. Cortisol is just like rock bottom because they burned out. They look and see that their HRV has like tanked by 50, 60, 70%. And they're like, but I don't feel better. But all these other men are saying they're doing it and it feels great. And their numbers might even show that it's great. And I would say, I think, again, that is just kind of like, unfortunately, like, the male community of biohacking is very prevalent. And sometimes a lot of the voices, this is why I'm so glad, like you and others, my friends, Lauren, Renee, and Molly Eastman, and like all the great, awesome biohacking women are making like a stand in this area for the better, because a lot of more voices need to be heard kind of for women, in that there is no like one size fits all. We should do everything that kind of like a man does, but also we can use the data as a great determinant as to whether or not this is something that is effective. So, one thing that we know is that like incorporating forms of what we refer to as hormetic stress, or eustress is another term, can be very effective, but we have to use our data for a guide. Let me give you an example. So like if I see, and I'm just going to use kind of a flat, easy to understand example, if my overnight aura score or Hanu score throughout the day, let's say is 50 milliseconds, it's pretty stable day over day, week over week, around 50 milliseconds, that's where I'm at. And I start saying, but, I start feeling some stress of the day, stress of the week, stress of the month, work stress, relationship stress, it all happens. And I'm like, oh, well, let me kind of do something about it. And I'm going to, go get in cold plunge each day. I'm going to go do a sauna each day. And I start to see that day in and day over a day, like we just see a decrease in HRV. And then I also say, but I feel burnt out. I feel like I have a lack of energy, lack of motivation and vitality. Well, what those number changes in HRV are showing us is that we're overreaching and overtraining. It would just be like us, being worn out from a physiological perspective and doing a bunch of CrossFit workouts in 1 week, when we really needed to rest and recover and do some things like meditation and biofeedback and ways to engage the parasympathetic branch of our nervous system so we can use that data to guide us. I would also say that the unfortunate thing that happens a lot of times in the biohacking community is that we say, let's throw biohacks at it. Just like you mentioned, I've got this tech, this tech, this tech, this tech, this thing, this thing, this thing, when there might be a lot more of the emotional, psychological things that we need to confront and we need to process. I mean, it is one of the main reasons, not to sound too pitchy, but it's one of the main reasons that why us at Hanu, because at the core of us, we are a mental health and emotional health company. We decided to open up a branch, a service branch of licensed mental health therapists that use our technology, because we know the impact that seeing someone who is very well balanced in therapy and lifestyle issues, as well as psychophysiology or biofeedback and Hanu type stuff, can be such a perfect combination for walking through difficulties that we're having emotionally, psychologically, relationally. We don't want to minimize those impacts. And so I think that, yes, is there a place for all this really cool biohacking stuff? Of course there is. But also, might we need some therapy and some emotional and mental health coaching therapeutic strategies? Absolutely. And then can we use the data to help serve as a guide, heart rate variability to serve as a guide as to, number one, is this working pretty well for my nervous system? Number two, how am I just doing from a nervous system perspective overall? The answer is absolutely.
Yeah, I love that you have started to incorporate therapists, because the thing that I have found too is, we are finally getting to a place in the space where emotional health is now at the forefront. We have done the physical, and that is great, right? To get your body in a good physical shape. But the emotional aspect, I think, has been so underlooked. And I love that you have therapists who are also realizing the demographic of people coming to Hanu, where they maybe are a little bit more savvy. I've had those experiences with therapists, and I mean, and it's not to sound egotistical, but it's like, okay, I know why you're asking me to do this. And I start to think about how it's going to affect my nervous system and what my scores are going to, and so I think having someone who gets that, okay, you might be savvy, you might be ready for a new type of, intervention. And this is a great tool that you can now actually accurately measure. So coming from a new framework for people, because we're all on different journeys. We all have different experiences with taking care of our emotional health. Yeah. And it's this beautiful complement that you guys have worked on putting together. So I really commend that.
Well, thank you. The way we frame this is that it is time to modernize therapy. Therapy has actually remained unchanged for the most part for 50, 60, 70 years. It's not super different than what we did 50, 60, 70 years ago. The main component that we miss, what they do right, what therapy does right, is the ability to process how thoughts are related to emotions and behaviors. That's a huge component that a therapist can work with. And then just the ability to process and develop rapport and have accountability. What has been traditionally missed is the focus on things like high quality sleep and nutrition and exercise, but also we add in the beautiful layer of technology and data and biofeedback. And we say that marrying these two is just such a great recipe for enhancing overall mental well-being and emotional health. I think that this is the next wave. It's been kind of it's almost like psychology and mental health has separated themselves somewhat from kind of this other space that I'm referring to. And now it's we're marrying them at Hanu. And what we're seeing is that so many individuals are saying, no, now I have I have my therapist that I see and we process and we work through kind of all of these great things. But then I kind of take a little bit of my therapist with me throughout the day. And I have that continuous monitoring and coaching and guiding and training with the Hanu platform. And I think that's just a really good mix, because so many people are like, well, I go see my therapist for an hour a week or every 2 weeks. And then through the rest of the time, I kind of feel like, I'm out on my own. Well, now we want something that bridges the gap, which is where Hanu comes into play.
100%. I'd love to talk a little bit about biofeedback, because I know you mentioned that earlier, and it sort of piqued my interest, because you're like, when you do a biofeedback session, I didn't realize how much it can actually start to move the needle with your HRV. Talk to me a little bit about why that is the case and how people can actually utilize this.
Yeah, I think kind of opening up the conversation as to what biofeedback is kind of at its core is a really helpful place to start. So what is biofeedback? Well, if we just break apart the word, it is we're getting feedback from our biology. So many people, especially in the health and wellness space, but a lot of people now are very familiar with mindfulness and meditation and breath work practices. And these are great practices. We incorporate them immensely within Hanu, and our therapists incorporate those really hardcore. The one thing, though, that happens with a lot of people is that starting a meditative practice, starting a breathwork practice is something that they can get into, but then after a week, 2 weeks, kind of phases off. And we've done surveys and we've asked a lot of people, well, like, what's going on there? Like, why do you think there's like this drop off? And they're like, well, I see help, but it's like, sometimes I'm like, I'm not so sure I'm convinced. Whereas with biofeedback, we are taking a lot of those skills of teaching functional breathing, using meditative practices, and we're layering it with data so that people can see in real time, how is your nervous system responding? Why is that so incredibly valuable? Because we can convince ourselves sometimes that I think that was helpful, but I'm not sure. If your mind is that position, the likelihood of you following through with more meditative behaviors, breathing behaviors, slim to none, right? If you're not convinced fully about it, probably not going to happen. But what if you add a layer of objective data on there? And it's like, oh my goodness, in the 5 minutes I did this, I saw my HRV go from 50 to 100. It increased by 100%. Well, now the brain is going to become conditioned to think, yes, this is indeed effective because I just saw it with my own eyes. And you cannot lie when it comes to physiology. Your physiology responds the way that it is responding. And so what I love about biofeedback is you can sit down and show someone both in session what is happening with their nervous system and how it's responding effectively, but also over time. And you can show, man, when we first started, you were increasing your HRV by 10% during a session. You've been practicing now daily for the last 6 months, and now you're increasing it by 60%, 70% within a session. And what that is showing that individual is that, man, they have gone into the nervous system gym, created some great control over the nervous system. And now whenever at will, reflexively, when they need to control it, they have that ability to do it. Their nervous system just knows. It's just kind of like if you go and train, muscle memory with like free throws, right? You shoot, let's say 3 hours worth of free throws in basketball a day. You may not be super great when you first start, but once you create muscle memory, you're going to take your percentage from 30% to like maybe 50% or 60, 70% over time. The same thing happens with your nervous system. It may be that you encounter a stressor within your environment, like any given moment. Maybe it's right now you're experiencing stress, and your ability to control that response is pretty limited because you don't have great self-awareness or great self-regulation. But if you use biofeedback as a tool and train over and over and over and over and over again, well, then when you encounter experience that is stressful, you're going to still experience some stress, but your body's going to reflexively come in and start to control itself so that that experience is no longer nearly as severe. The duration's not as long. Maybe even the frequency of how your body responds is going to be limited or reduced. So I think of it as a great way to train the nervous system with data or information so that you can identify, again, in real time, you can see that this is actually working. So yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a long one.
No, that's great. I mean, it's like you're rewiring your default mode network, right? Because I think we all sort of just fall into this, place, and I'll speak for myself, but like where when I do get stressed, I feel it immensely in my stomach, in my throat, I get hot, and to be able to control that, it seems so far out of my reach. But with something like a biofeedback tool, and again, just to reiterate, this is not going to happen overnight. It is something that it takes a period of time to see the results. But then once you've done it long enough, it's like it becomes second nature, which is ultimately what we want to do.
Yeah. You just made such a valuable point, Katie. This is not an overnight thing, right? Just like your ability to, run a PR or maybe just run a marathon period isn't an overnight thing, right? If you're benching 135 pounds in the gym and your goal is to bench 225, you going and doing one workout isn't going to take you from 135 to 225.
I'll just injure myself horribly.
Exactly. Yes. So we have to be extremely patient with this, but we have to be consistent. That is the thing, right? It's like, I think so many people, they, and again, this is not me speaking bad of the biohacking community. I'm a part of the biohacking community, speaking to the biohacking community. But sometimes we think, let me go get this PMF machine, and that's going to be the thing that kind of changes my nervous system overnight. Or we think, let me go get this really cool tech, and that's going to change me overnight. And then we're like, well, shit, this is not working. And I just spent 10 grand on it. What I love about this, and obviously I should be the fox guarding the hen house a little bit, and saying, yeah, everybody go buy a Hanu because it will change your life. I do believe that, by the way. But however, what I will say is that these things that we're training are things that are accessible to us at all times. The data adds a whole layer of accountability and conditioning, but we can do all of these things kind of really within our own time. No one has to know that we're doing them, and they're readily accessible to us. It's the beauty of all of this. But again, like just thinking, oh, if I, train biofeedback, once a month for a couple minutes, I'm not so positive or confident that you're going to see maybe the results that you want. Now, could you see some results? Maybe, but it's probably more likely if you're doing it consistently. Let's say just doing a small session a couple times a week, once a day is kind of like ideal. Just consistency is key here.
Yeah. I have one last question before we wrap things up. And I'm so grateful for just all of the knowledge that I feel like every time I have a conversation with you, I learn something new, and it's really interesting. So let's talk about the word stress. Very much like the word biohack, which sometimes gives people this guttural reaction of like, oh, that doesn't sound like something I want to do. When I hear the word stress, I sometimes get stressed, and I feel like our culture has sort of demonized stress.
Oh man.
But you work for a company that is kind of not embracing stress, but owning what that means for the body, owning what. And so what's your take on stress, and is it warranted to look at it like that?
Yeah, beautiful question, because yes, so many people, they hear the word stress and they automatically become stressed. And I would say that we have been somewhat conditioned to think of stress and hear stress, think of it negatively. There's a negative automatic connotation that comes with stress. I want anybody listening to this to reconceptualize stress right now. And I want you to think of, and I'm going to explain why. So I'm not just going to say think of it this way and then leave it be. I'm going to explain why. But I want everybody to reconceptualize stress as not inherently bad, but inherently good. So what I'm coming out and saying is that stress at its core is a good thing. So you're saying, Jay, why are you saying stress is a good thing? That can't be right. Let me explain. What is stress at its core? Stress is a warning sign. Anxiety is a warning sign. It is simply a detection system that screams out for you to pay attention. Something may potentially be life-threatening to you. Now, with modern stress, especially chronic stress, which I'll talk about why that is not good, the warning sign that is occurring a lot of the times is coming from our own perception of events and us labeling it as detrimental or deleterious. Stress is, again, the warning sign saying, check in, something is going on. And that may save your life, right? If you never experience stress, right, then we would go around kind of walking around, not thinking kind of twice about things. And likely we just kind of walk into traffic and get hit. But if we have the stress response who kicks in, where if we're not paying attention and we go to step in the street, but we hear a whoosh by us, oh, we back up. Stress response has just saved your life and done what it should do. So acute, transient, short-term stress is a good thing. It's the lifesaver. Does it have a potential deleterious or negative effect on the body? Yes, in one sense it does. It's going to drive up heart rate. It's going to drive up blood pressure. It's going to increase kind of the secretion of cortisol and norepinephrine, epinephrine. So that can have a small little ding on the body, but the body is so resilient that it recovers from it and never knew that it happened. Now, what if this happens over again, day in, day out, months turn into years, turn into decades? Now we have problems because the body's inherent natural stress response system is being activated far too often. And when that compounds, we call that chronic stress, which is bad. That form of stress, not good, because that's going to increase kind of baseline blood pressure. It's going to increase or decrease, significantly increase cortisol, and then potentially tank it if we have adrenal, burnout, fatigue. There are a lot of negatives associated with this elongated form of chronic stress. So that is what we're really trying to work to increase better self-awareness of and better self-regulation of. But stress, again, at its core, if we just look at it as a warning sign for us initially, I think that helps us to be less stressed about our stress. We want our stress response to do its job. Turn off and turn on and then turn off when it needs to. And then, but what's happening to many of us is that it turns on, stays on. Yeah. That's the biggest problem. So that is, again, that's the way that I view stress. And again, I know we haven't gotten into like hormetic stress, but again, we can use stress for our advantage. I mean, this is what exercise is. This is what, going to the sauna and cold plunge, as long as we're doing it reasonably and using good data and subjective check-ins to make sure that we're not overdoing it. These are ways where we can actually use stress to our advantage. It is the compounding chronic stress day in and day out that sometimes we become less self-aware of, because us as humans, we're really good about just bulldoze through, push through stress, take it, push it aside. And we think maybe it goes away. We haven't pushed it aside. What we've done is kind of put it in our back pocket where it's growing until one day, like if you have enough compounding stress, I always say that humans do one of two things with compounding chronic stress. We're either going to implode or we're going to explode. And what we want to do is prevent that from ever happening, because the last thing you want to do is explode. And the next thing you know, you go off on your coworkers, you just lost your job. You go off on your spouse, you've just really harmed a relationship. You go off of your children, harmed a relationship, or you implode. And the next thing you know, you're depressed, you're in the room by yourself, you're socially isolated. We want to prevent that from happening. And it starts with becoming more self-aware of how stress is impacting you, and then teaching yourself to self-regulate. And then one last point that I'll make here, the whole goal is not to avoid psychological or relational stress. That's not going to happen. Like, life is going to have its stress. So I don't want to say, hey, let's try to dodge stress. No, accept stress, accept that it's there, and accept it for what it is, a warning sign. But also check in with your perception of stress, because a lot of times we like to label things as stressful and therefore harmful. Whereas we might say, instead of a reframe, this is more the psychologist in me coming out with kind of cognitive reframing, saying, yeah, I'm experiencing stress, but how can I use it? Like, how can I use it to my advantage? That's a key kind of cognitive mindset shift that we have to make. And when we make that, we see that our nervous system responds in a very effective way, and we can stabilize our heart rate variability more.
Yeah. I also feel like I might have been the person that glorified stress at one point in my life. Like, I'm so stressed out. I have all this stuff on my plate. I thrive on stress, under pressure. And in some ways, like, I asked for more of it until my bucket got overloaded. And then you burn out. Right. And it's like, oh, what, so.
Well, Katie, isn't that like, don't we reward like stress? Like, we reward it. We say, oh man, you're the 80-hour, 100-hour work week person. Man, good for you. Go get them. And again, I'm not trying to demonize that. There have been times in my life where I've had those periods working, at a startup. However, like, glorifying that, both if we do it, I've done it in my past, and then also kind of culturally glorifying kind of the hard charging, like, never sleep, I'll sleep when I die type thing. No, you'll die because you didn't sleep, and you'll die because you had way too much compounding chronic stress. That's what we really want to just pump the brakes on and reframe that mindset and say, no, we can use stress. It's an inherent warning sign that can be good for us. But what we don't want to have is say, let me just live in this perpetual state of chronic stress, because we know that will eventually put us in the grave.
Okay. One last pop quiz question, just because you've been studying this for years. Is America, like the United States continental, like the most stressed country in the world?
This is what is interesting. The studies that they have done have actually demonstrated that we Americans are the most chronically stressed in certain kind of, like, it's almost like categories. Because again, if you look at, let's say, third world countries where there's like impoverished individuals who do not have food or shelter, they are experiencing a whole different level of chronic stress. Whereas we as Americans, it's not as much kind of survival threats to us, which can cause significant stress. It's more mental perceptive stress. And so therefore, I would say that, yes, they have identified that from a perception mindset perspective, Americans are. But again, globally, you have plenty of third world impoverished countries that are experiencing more stress and more detrimental stress to us. It's just kind of in a different bucket or category, if you will, which means that ours is way more preventable. And so therefore it's like, come on, there's a little bit of a check-in that we have to do here. We can do something about this. Whereas there are some, individuals in other countries where it is much more of an uphill battle and challenge for them to escape the inherent environmental stressors they are in because of simply, where they are and kind of what they have and what they don't have. So yeah, we have the opportunity to do something about it. So we probably should.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you again for kind of highlighting the differences of stress, because it just shows how granular, like stress is not just a one size fits all. There's so many different layers of stress. And so I think hopefully everyone has kind of taken something away from that, and maybe a tool or two to guide yourself out of that state of mental stress, because it's almost inevitable in life, and knowing how to be resilient is going to be the best thing. So Dr. J, where can people find you? Talk a little bit more about Hanu and how can anybody sign up to work with a therapist now?
Absolutely. So the way we do it, so we have kind of like multiple options. The first option is that if you're like, well, yeah, I just like kind of the wearable plus, the software platform, we sell that kind of as a package. And Katie said, excuse me, I don't know if have we given you guys a discount code? Because if we haven't, we will. I just can't remember.
We can definitely do one, and we'll just link it below for everyone, so you can check it out. Yeah.
Sounds good. So we'll give a 20% off coupon code on the platform itself. So hanuhealth.com, on the top navigation bar, get Hanu. The other one would be the Get Therapy bar, which is you are matched up with a licensed therapist who is trained and specialized in how to use Hanu, but also they're a therapist as well. So they're trained in that background in psychology and therapy. And so we have different options. You can just say, hey, I want to try this as a one-off. I have one session with them, see how it goes, and then continue my time. You can do it that way. And so you can buy one session. You can also say I want to get into a cadence of twice a month or 4 times a month, like once a week. We have that as well. So we really try to match you based on the therapist's expertise and kind of their background area, whether it's sleep or anxiety or depression or, performance, whatever it may be, and then get you to that individual. So we really tailor and customize this to you. So it's all at hanuhealth.com, hanuhealth.com/therapy if you want to just go the direct link there. And we'll get you the discount code as well.
Hey, that's a wrap for today. But before we go, I want to share something I've been diving into recently. The best way to use GLP-1s like semaglutide, known as Ozempic or Wegovy, and tirzepatide, also called Mounjaro. These powerful weight loss peptides have become widely used over the past few years, but there's also been a flood of misinformation on how to use them safely and effectively. I made my own share of mistakes over the past few years, learning through trial and error as I work to improve my own metabolic health. I want to give you the shortcut to help you avoid these pitfalls so you can use these peptides more effectively. That's why I created a free mini course to give you the blueprint for using GLP-1s for body recomposition the right way. I will cover optimal dosing strategies, important lifestyle and hormone optimization steps, all of which can help you avoid plateaus and eventually taper off these peptides safely once your goals are reached. Now, to access this free mini video course, just scroll down to the show notes and dive right in. It's all there waiting for you. And remember, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and it is not a substitute for professional medical advice.